Well, I think we've got a good program for everyone this morning. We were thinking about how to sort of brand this seminar, this symposium. We came up with the idea that it is behind the curtain, sort of pulling the curtain back to see what's behind the curtain. Research is a science, and there is some mysticism to research that we thought it would be really helpful to kind of pull back the curtain and see what's behind that to demystify some of the research that we do. So part of this is a learning to be able to talk a little bit more about how we approach research, the techniques that we use, and how we interpret the results. We, as Andrew was talking, GMA Research has been working with arts organizations for quite a long time. I've been personally involved and on the board of a number of arts organizations, and we love the arts. We think it's part of the integral fabric of this region, as it is in many regions throughout the country, and there's no question that we're living in some very challenging times today. So what we did is we reached out to several different experts, and I'm delighted that we're able to have Nancy Hardwick from Hardwick Research here today and Max Israel from Customerville, because they will be bringing to this symposium some thoughts and ideas and how they approach research from their own perspective. And they're great speakers. I think every time I hear them talk, I learn something. And I'm sure you all will as well. So we're going to try and we're going to move quickly through a lot of the information that we have. Please take notes, although you're going to get a copy of the video, you're going to get a copy of the PowerPoint, so you have a lot of that as kind of background information that you can use. But I do want to emphasize, we would really, even though we've got a large group here, we want to keep this informal as much as possible. There'll be a couple of times where we're going to do a Q&A. So really feel like you can open up and ask questions. We want you to understand what we're talking about. Many of you have participated in a lot of the research, especially the techniques that we talk about, at many different levels. Either you're doing it right now as a part of your organization, or you've been involved in it with others, or you've participated yourself in a focus group. And chances are you've participated a lot in surveys. We have just survived sort of a huge impacting political time. And there's a lot of surveying that was going on. And in fact, Max will talk a little bit about that, some of his perspective, as I will as well, on the polling that went on during, during the political season. But we want you to really enjoy this morning. We want to have some fun, we want to educate, we want to entertain, really be a part of this whole process. And it doesn't end this morning. Anytime that you have questions, any one of you individually or your organizations, you want to reach out to us directly or through ArtsFund, what we want to do is make sure that we are a resource for the community. We have been working for a long time with a lot of different organizations and collectively, as was mentioned, but we want to make sure that you use the research, because we want to emphasize how important that is to use that to have the best job that you can do. So that's actually a photo of my younger brother, I think. And I'm growing this because it's basically Cancer Awareness Month, Men's Cancer Awareness Month. So, and I kind of like the look, so I think I might just keep it for a while. But that's actually, I do a lot of expert witness testimony in court cases involving trademark and name infringement. And this is my expert witness photo, so I just thought I'd throw that in there. Nancy, I won't go into a lot of background, but Nancy is an expert in qualitative research. She has led the charge both internationally as well as throughout the country. She is very much involved in a number of associations, international associations. She is a well sought after lecturer and presenter, and looking forward to what she's going to share with us about the qualitative side of research, particularly focus groups, which I think are very valid extremely important technique in the research that you do and how we can do that and how we can do them better. I've known Max for a long time, and his story about Customerville is absolutely fascinating. The customer experience is one of the biggest things in not only research today, but in business today, no matter what kind of business you're in. So how do we get feedback? How do we involve that in the process? Max works with a lot of national, international companies. Locally, when you're on a flight, for example, when you fly on Alaska Airlines, Max has created a platform for basically passenger feedback that he'll talk a little bit about. Fascinating work that they're doing. They're really one of the leading, if not the leading company in the customer experience research field, which is a huge, huge field today. We're delighted that he's here. We had to actually go out and pick him up off an airplane and bring him here today because he's always on, not quite that, but he's always on airplanes. So let's get started. Let's begin our journey this morning about, first of all, why we do research. There's a number of factors that are involved in this process that include the things that are listed here. I think most importantly, when you think about changes in the population shift, and the demographics of the population, being able to understand that kind of change, research can play a strategic role in accomplishing that. We know that there's many different changes psychographically in terms of lifestyles, so having information at our fingertips that really helps us better understand what those shifts are, helps us understand better how to operate our own business, our own arts organization, how to reach out to our different audiences. Obviously, the impact of social media is huge. We can't talk about it enough. We just completed a study sponsored in part by Chihuly Garden and Glass for the Glass Art Society. In fact, we were back in Chicago just last week to present this study. We basically looked at how the public views glass art and how the glass art community views glass art. And one of the key findings from that study was the impact of social media on the glass art world from a public perspective, but also from a community perspective when it comes to the glass artists. That social media has really raised the bar for the artist community as a way of staying connected, of being able to communicate, as a way of learning. So you can't overplay that, the impact that social media has on everything that we're doing. And of course, the competition. We are really competing for time when we are in an arts organization or any organization that deals with the public. So being conscious of time and how that time evolves in the role that it plays in the public making decisions as to what they're going to do is critical for us to understand. And of course, the economy and the trends, just general trends in the world of the consumer, the things that are going on in their lives impact everything that we do. Business trends, world events certainly have an impact right here at home as well as on a national and certainly on a world scale. And then critically, the last but certainly not least is why do research? Because we need to measure, we need to monitor, and then we need to take action on that information. Not just measuring, but what do we do with that information as a part of that process? We look at a lot of different audiences when we're in the arts. It's not just the public, but if you look at this list, these are all the different segments that we need to have some connectivity with, whether they're subscribers or members, or in some cases, the lapsed subscriber or the lapsed member, the person that used to be a part of the community that's no longer there. What do we do about that? Is that a trend, and how do we understand that better? Single ticket patrons, past single ticket patrons, those that have never attended. You know, if you're the Seattle Opera, part of the charge today, one of the mandates for opera, because we work with opera a lot, is how do you engage the community at large? Not just the opera goer, but how do you engage the community at large? People who have never been to opera and may never be a real core group of the audience, but how do you reach out to them? And the public has a role in supporting all of the arts, whether they participate in one in particular. Certainly the talent involved in the performing arts is an audience. It's a segment. The staff, the volunteers. If you think about all of the volunteers that work and contribute their time and effort to many of the organizations. We work with the Seattle International Film Festival. You think about literally hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of volunteers that dedicate their lives for almost a month. For 25 days, they are working every single day, volunteering their time. They have a huge impact on what SIF does, how they operate, what they do. So those are key groups that all of you have to rely on volunteers. Keep in mind that volunteers are an audience. Certainly the media, our sponsors, financial supporters who may not be sponsors but make personal contributions. And I'm sure there's some that I've left off that list that you can add. All of those are segments that are a part of this. But what it really comes down to is what we call strategic intelligence. Strategic intelligence basically pertains to collection, processing, analysis, and dissemination of intelligence that's required for policy and planning. That's kind of an academic definition, but the critical part of this is that we need to think strategically when we're thinking about information. How do we use that research as a part of our ongoing policies, as a part of our ongoing operations? So we want you to really, if you take some things away today, one of the things to really take away is how do we think strategically? How do we incorporate research as a part of our strategic thinking and start thinking about this concept of strategic intelligence? There are changes that are occurring in technology, in customer demands, in the competition, all of the things that go on to really create a better understanding. So one of the things that we really want to focus on is how do we take all of these different pieces of research and kind of fold them into this fabric of strategic intelligence, whether it's reaching out to our audiences, talking internally to our staff. How do all of these different pieces form kind of that fabric of information that helps us make better decisions, helps us survive in challenging times, in competitive times, and also is gratifying to us because it tells us how we're doing. It's kind of the report card to us that monitors the kind of job that we're doing as an organization and as a functioning part of that organization. So here are just some beginning things to think about when it comes to sort of the keys to the game, the keys to conducting effective research. Seems pretty simplistic, but it's really important. We need to identify what our needs are versus our wants. We want to emphasize on needs. You need that information. You may want a lot of pieces of information. And too often when we're planning research, when it comes to the topics we want to cover, how long the survey is going to be, there's always a lot of wants in there that aren't maybe necessary. So we really need to divide up needs from wants, things that we need that we actually can use, that we can take action on and really better understand versus the wants of things that we would like to have, but maybe we don't really need them. We need to set some priorities. Obviously, there's priorities in terms of the kind of information that we can get and how we're going to use that. So prioritizing that set of information needs is critical. Research methods that we'll talk a lot about today, which match those needs and budgets. Research can cost a lot, but there's also ways that we can cut through that, and we'll talk a little bit about that. A lot of the organizations here today have no research budget whatsoever. I mean, you are the research people that are going to be doing it, or you have to reach out and convince somebody, get some volunteers. So we want to help you through that because there are ways that you can do it inexpensively or gratis. So we want you to have a sort of a game plan for doing that. And so looking at those different techniques, integrating research into your operation and planning it. Quite often, research is an afterthought. Maybe, after that particular series or after that performance or after that exhibit, somebody says, well, yeah, we get anecdotal feedback, but we really don't get feedback on an organized way. We want you to think about integrating research as an ongoing part of the operation, as an ongoing part of the organization, because it can be very critical. really, bottom line is incorporating it as a way of thinking. Having that as a part of the culture of the organization. Think research, think strategically. How are we going to get this information? How are we going to use it as a part of our overall process? Critical, critical, critical. So that's kind of the lead into what Nancy's going to talk about. I am really delighted. I've known Nancy for a long time, have worked with her with lots of different clients as well as the organizations that we belong to. And when she agreed to come in and talk to us about qualitative research, I was absolutely over the moon, because she is the leading expert in qualitative research, particularly in focus groups. When you think focus groups, it's hard to not think about Nancy Hardwick. So we are really delighted that Nancy's going to share some thoughts today and take you through kind of the process. So take notes, and be thinking about questions too as we go through this process.
Thank you for having me here today. I'm going to share with you some information about qualitative research. Before I get specific on qualitative, let's go ahead and look at the difference between qualitative and quantitative. In my mind, the easy way to remember it is qualitative is quality. I'm after that in-depth information, detailed understanding of why people do what they do, what's causing them to have that attitude or have that particular behavior. Versus quantitative as in quantity. I'm after a lot of people. I really want to understand. I want a representative sample. I've got to talk to 400 people to get a really good idea and to be able to say my information is projectable against the population. So there are a couple of different options here. Let's throw in that other. So for quantitative research, you're looking at things like telephone surveys, mail survey, online surveys. So those are some options for you. You can even do intercept interviews. I have a client who has us do 400 intercepts. So you never know what you're going to turn into when you do the quantitative. Qualitative is my passion. It's in my mind the fun stuff. I like it because I get to talk to people in person. It's the telephone I don't do, the online I design, somebody else fills out, but the qualitative is really the fun part in my mind as far as it goes for market research. So there's a variety of methodologies that fall into that area. Focus groups is a real obvious one, and that's the idea of bringing 8 people into a room, set them around a table, talk to them for a couple of hours, and really get in depth with them. There's online focus groups. You do the same thing, except in an online environment. It's essentially like a chat room. And people sit in front of a computer and type for an hour and a half and answer your questions. You can do online bulletin board discussions. Same idea in a sense, but instead of an hour and a half together, they spend maybe 3 to 5 days. They come a couple times a day, and they answer whatever questions you posted. Then you've got in-depth interviews. That's more of a one-on-one environment where you can sit down with someone and share and get some feedback from them. Usability is another one. Immediately you think of websites, but it's even ATMs. It's how do they get to your bathrooms? How do they walk through your facility? So it could be other things. Ethnography, observational research, and then mobile research. I'm going to really concentrate today on focus groups, but before I jump there, I want to talk about in-depth interviews. This is something that's pretty easy for you to do. You don't have to worry a whole lot about a lot of logistics or how to manage a group. This is really one-on-one. And I'm sure you probably do this in your role at some point anyway. You talk to the folks that you come into contact with, those coming to your events or seeing your displays. The idea with one-on-ones is you can really sit down and talk with them. Take advantage of making this very formal. So in the sense of, you have conversations all the time, but actually put together a guide of the questions that you want to ask and talk with maybe 10 different people. You can use this to target a particular group you're interested in. So if you have questions about millennials, talk to some millennials. But the idea with this in-depth interviews is don't just make it that fun conversation, but make it an outline. Have some specific things in mind that you're going to cover when you're doing these. So I'm going to go ahead and start talking about focus groups. Focus groups, I think, are the best methodology, if I could pick one, in my opinion. I love the idea of being able to bring a group of people together and get their feedback. In a focus group setting, you get to take advantage of that group think. So you get to have people share their opinions and see if other folks agree or disagree. You may have someone who has a super strong opinion in that group. That's great. They could be the voice of your competitor. They could be the voice of a naysayer. You want to find out how what they have to say influences the rest of the group. So I really think focus groups are a valuable tool for you. There are some challenges with them as far as looking at costs. Focus groups can be expensive. You've got to recruit these people. You've got to put them in a facility. Are you going to use a meeting room you have, or are you going to get a professional facility where you've got a mirror and you get to sit behind it? You've got to put together a discussion guide. You've got to actually lead these discussions. Do you pay these folks for being there? My firm belief is if you really are looking to get feedback and you want to hear from perhaps some of the less involved folks that you might come into contact with, you're going to have to pay them. You're asking them, in my mind, to get off the couch after a long day of work. They should be at home helping their kids with homework or sitting back and watching TV or preparing for the next day, and you're asking them to come in and talk to you for 2 hours. So perhaps on a topic that may not be that close to their hearts. So you have to think about incentives and then doing the analysis. So some options for you for focus groups. Obviously, you can conduct these in your own meeting rooms or public spaces, the library. There's a variety of choices there to cut some costs for you. You also may talk to a research firm and have them help you with just a part of it. So, for example, I did some work with the Seattle Public Library, and they did their own recruit. So they recruited the people, and we used a meeting room at the library, and I just was brought in to develop a discussion guide and moderate. I wrote a report for them, but you might want to write your own report and have me just look at it, for example. So you can do bits and pieces. Do you have a question? Oh, okay, perfect. So let's talk about focus groups really quickly. The benefits of them is that they are a great opportunity to get in depth and really understand someone's feelings and beliefs and attitudes and why they are doing what they do. They are a great chance for you to get to really understand your subscribers or the people who come and visit your facilities, to get to know them. If there's a particular target market, this is your chance. You want to hear about millennials? Do a group of millennials. Baby boomers? Go for it. I mean, you've got some options. And again, the cost can be an issue. Also, you want to remember that although you're going to get a lot of great direction and in-depth information, that group of 10 people is not going to be representative of the entire population. But one thing I do want to caution you is I personally would recommend you try and do 2 groups, especially as a confirmation that what you're hearing from that first group is actually the same feelings as another group. For example, when I did some research for Samsung for washers and dryers, we had someone come into the group. One of the concepts had to do with running your dryer at night, and we were testing that idea, and a participant came in, started talking about their experience with washers and dryers, talked about a dryer fire and how the house burned down, and of course the idea of running your dryer at night when you're asleep and your house burns down, not going to fly. So that was something that in that case we were glad that we had done a couple of groups, because that concept can't be tested in that group. Okay, so as you're doing any type of research, I would highly recommend, as Don has suggested, that you sit down and think about what it is that you really want to learn. I've got some in italics, some questions for you under each of these sections. Why are you doing the research? Sit down with your team and figure this out. What do you already know? What do you want to learn? Are there specific questions you're trying to answer? One of my favorite is if you could ask any question you want, what would it be? So think about these types of things as you're deciding what it is that you're going to conduct for research and what questions and information you're trying to gather. Also, think about how you're going to use the information. If you're not going to use the answers to a question, don't ask it. You have a very limited amount of time. Whether you're doing an online survey or whether you're doing a 2-hour focus group, you have to be careful and really concentrate on what it is you're trying to learn and want to understand. So when I put together a discussion guide for focus groups, it is something that is really a tool for me. I've sat down with my team that I'm working with, and you would do the same thing, and figure out what it is we want to learn and prioritize those in order. When I put a guide in order, it doesn't mean I always follow it, but some of the aspects of a discussion guide for a 2-hour group might fall out like this. I've got timing for you, 15 minutes for an introduction, 15 for a warm-up, 75 minutes for that investigation, the really in-depth, and then 15 minutes for some type of concluding exercises. Take this same format, and you can narrow it down if you're going to do a half-an-hour one-on-one interview. The idea is that you want to start by introducing yourself. If there's a focus group, letting people introduce each other. You want to have them feel comfortable talking and answering your questions. So I always start my warm-up with something super easy, something that's they can answer without a lot of effort, something that will get them talking and comfortable. Then you can jump into your details where you're really getting into understanding their responses. And then I always do some type of a conclusion at the end. I like asking things like, if you had a chance to speak to the board of directors of this organization, what would you want to tell them? What do you think they want to know? So that type of thing I always like to do at the end as well. So think of this as you are putting together your guide or your list of questions that you might ask somebody, whether it's one-on-one or in a focus group setting. I have a list here for you of some good questions to ask. These are probes. These are questions that you can ask to try and get additional information. I've things like, what do you mean by that? Tell me more. How come? What makes that important? What's the main reason? How does that differ from something else? Asking these types of questions will help you get a lot more detail, get behind those simple answers. Participants have the tendency, especially initially, to try and answer questions the way they think you want to hear. What is it that you want to hear? They'll attempt to answer that. They also tend to be a little bit more politically correct and cautious of people's feelings, and we want to get more information and get a lot deeper and get their honest responses. So I use questions like these to really elicit information. One thing I want to point out with this list, there's not one question up there that begins with why. I don't like to ask why. When you ask why, someone is now defending themselves. Why did you do that? You're on the defense. I want to know what caused you to do that. What happened that made you feel that way? I'm trying to get into the emotions, the feelings, the reasons behind what they're doing. And you get a lot better explanation if you ask what caused that than why. So it's hard. I still to this day will catch myself in focus groups or in-depth interviews asking why. And it's so hard to get away from doing that. But here's a whole list of other questions that you could use. One suggestion is when I build my discussion guide, I build it almost as if you're reading a conversation. So if you were to read it, you would feel like you were sitting there in the room and I was actually having a conversation with you. I do that on purpose to be careful that I don't do whys. I also do it on purpose so that I know what types of things I want to ask and the information I'm looking to gather. So keep these types of questions in mind. Ask whatever your key question is and add in a couple of follow-up probes to be sure you're getting that detail. This is another technique. They're called projective techniques. It's something that's used a lot in focus groups. I've also done it in one-on-one interviews. I've also done it online. The idea is I'm asking, again, another indirect question. rather than asking somebody what they like about the Wing Luke Museum, I want to ask them to pick an image, and I will have a whole pile of photos, pictures available for them to look at. Pick an image that represents how they feel about the wing. They then will look at the images that I have, and I've just thrown a few up here for you to see. When I pick images that have multiple meanings. So, for example, the sheep, that could be following what everybody else is doing. That could be having a whole lot of choices to pick from. That could be feeling cramped. They have many meanings, and so I purposefully pick, your superhero. This little boy here is your superhero. He could be celebrating. He could be pretending. I don't know. It's your interpretation. Really what I'm after is, in the end, I don't care what picture the participants choose. So when I say, pick an image that best represents how you feel about the Wing Luke Museum, I then have them show me the image they picked, don't care what it is, but tell me which image, what is it about that image that represents how you feel? And then that explanation, I uncover some amazing things. You have now walked out of being logical, and you've now had to explain to me how you feel about something with emotions. If the question answered is, I enjoy coming here to see the exhibits, there's no feeling in that. So I'll push back and say, well then, since you like coming here to see the exhibits, how does that make you feel? And really try to get in depth. So think about, as you're writing your questions and you're thinking about the things you want to learn, different ways you can go about doing it. There's collages, there's all kinds of things. It's not just questions and answers. Couple of things for you here. As you are, whether you are leading the discussion yourself or conducting the in-depth interview, or whether you are now an observer sitting behind the mirror in a focus group facility, or even along the wall in a room. I will do focus groups where I'll have a couple of clients sit off to the side. So you have that option. No matter what you're doing, what your involvement is, a few things to keep in mind. First of all, you have a dual role here. You are the experts on your organization, but you also need to be the researcher and be open-minded. So whether you are leading the discussion or whether you are observing it, keep those things in mind. You are not here to bias the participants in any way. You are here to observe, watch, be open-minded, and see what they have to say. You want to be sure that you're considering what's really being said. So listen to their responses. Listen to the way that they react to your questions. You want to listen for things like, what surprised you? What didn't you expect to hear? What confirmations did you get? Yep, that's what we thought. Good, we're confirmed on that. What things were contradictions? Things you didn't expect to hear. So be listening and considering what is actually being said. Number 3, leave your bias in the office. Don't show up with any branded materials. Whether you're sitting down one-on-one with someone or whether you're walking through a facility, you don't need to wear anything that is branded with your organization. But also, especially if you are sitting and listening, you want to be sure that you're getting to hear their experiences and your reactions and thoughts aren't biasing them. So be careful as you ask questions as well. Number 4, remember the mirror is not a wall. And this is especially true for my clients who sit behind a focus group mirror. They get this impression that there's a wall in front of them and nobody can hear what's on the other side. They can. So if you all in the back room laugh, they can hear it through the mirror, especially if they're not laughing, and then they don't understand what you're laughing at, and you've now biased the research. So you have to remember that the mirror is not a wall. It's really a mirror, and the person on the other side is the reflection of your target audience. or the people you're trying to talk to. So you need to listen to what they're saying and take that into consideration. Next one, even though you're in the dark, no daydreaming allowed. In other words, you have a role, whether you're sitting observing or whether you're actually conducting this research, to listen for themes that you're hearing, to actively take notes if that works for you, but you're looking at what are the impressions and what are the takeaways. As you're doing this, you want to follow your discussion guide, but you also might jump around. So there's no reason you can't follow the conversation. Even if you have a list of questions, you don't have to do them in order. Number 6, keep in mind that the dominant participants aren't always bad. That's always a complaint I hear. Well, how are you going to handle the dominant participants? Well, there's a bunch of techniques I can use to shut them down if need be, but sometimes the advantage of a dominant person is that they can take on a different role. They can be the role of the naysayer, or they can be the role of your competition, or whatever it may be. And they can add some interesting perspective to this. And so you can also take advantage of that person in your groups. So for me, if there's a dominant person and I'm having a focus group discussion, you can do things like turn your body away from them. You cannot look at them. You can get up and walk around the room and stand behind them. There are things you can do to stop people from being a dominant person. Those are just physical. Sometimes I'll say, I've heard enough, thank you. I've gotten your opinion. I'd like to hear from some of the others around the table. So you can do that as well. You can pick people out in the room and ask them questions. So there's a lot of things you can do, but remember that they also can add some advantage to your discussion if you're conducting focus groups. 7, even though it's been a long day, stick around for the debrief. My recommendation, if you're sitting in a back room behind the mirror in the dark watching these focus groups and you've sat through now 4 hours and it's dark and you're ready to go home, don't do it. If you have a team that's working on this and you're doing it, you split up one-on-one interviews and everybody's going to come together at the end and talk about the responses. However you do it, do that debrief. Sitting down and talking about what you've just heard or what you've learned over the last couple of days with your team is really valuable. Is everybody on the same page? Did we all hear the same thing? What things surprised us? What are our next steps based on this information? I think that's a really valuable approach. I always do it after my focus groups if I can get the clients to stay awake. But I think it would be something that I would definitely have you do as well when you're doing your research. Okay. Next step in this whole process is doing some kind of reporting. I typically do some type of written report, and I'm assuming that that would be of value for you to have reference if you do this yourself of some reports. So a few things to kind of keep in mind. First of all, I highly recommend you conduct more than one group. It may be a budget issue. You may just decide to do one. But then keep in mind that there may be different opinions out there, and take whatever you're hearing as a theme over and over again. Do keep in mind that the one loud person in the group may not be how everyone feels. So you want to hear many people say a particular response. Bring a note taker. If you're going to do a focus group and you're going to moderate it, have somebody there who can take some notes for you on the side. Record the discussion so that you have a record of it. You can record it for research purposes. You're not sharing with it. It's not going to end up on YouTube, but it's a way for you to go back later and rehear it. It's hard to lead the discussion and do that analysis of it at the same time. There's no way you can take notes. If you're leading a discussion or doing a one-on-one interview, it's almost impossible. I know a few experienced moderators who do it, but I don't do it. I've been moderating for years, and I think it's too hard. You can't concentrate on what the person is saying. So you can bring someone along, especially in a focus group setting, to take notes. One-on-one, bring a tape recorder. I highly recommend, if you are doing something in a focus group setting, that you do a mix of things. I like written exercises that lets each person share their own responses without the bias of the group first. Then you can discuss it. Now you have those sheets to take home. and assess. You can do things using the easel in the room if you want to. So keep in mind some of those things as you're putting together your analysis. I already talked about conducting the debrief and that you want to hear something from many people. I also really think that when you're done, whether you've just conducted a one-on-one interview or focus groups, in any case, just do a quick jot down of what your key takeaways were. What's sitting in your brain and sticking out is really valuable. So go ahead and write that down right away so that you've got that bullet point list. I'll do it after I've done an evening of focus groups. I'll write a bullet point list of my major themes and takeaways. There we go. Focus groups, in-depth interviews, any type of qualitative research is not for tallies. Please don't say 5 of the 8 people we spoke with feel this way. Don't do it. It's not the way we report this type of research, and honestly, it's not representative. It's not going to be 5 out of 8 of the general public think this way. I also don't put any charts or graphs in. I do lots of quotes. That's why you're doing qualitative research, is to hear what people have to say, hear the voice of the customer. So incorporating quotes, that type of thing really hits home. I also do leave out participant names if I put together a report. You can take photos if you're showing them something, if you're having them look at new advertising materials or brochures, whatever it is. I like to include pictures for documentation purposes. Somebody a year from now wants to pick up the research report you wrote. It's nice to have the information so you know exactly what was talked about or discussed. I write all qualitative reports in past tense. It's industry standard, at least that's my impression. It's a snapshot, it's not projectable. And then I would confirm what format is going to work best for you internally before you start writing. If it's a Word document, if it's a bullet point list, is it a PowerPoint? I think that'll help. You don't ever want to get yourself in a situation where you've done it one way and then they want you to do it a different way. So do confirm what is going to work best and what's the best type of thing to pass around. You might do something very detailed for yourself and do a quick top line to share with the rest of your team. Okay. I'll take questions if you have some.
My question was just if you could share any experience you have doing focus groups in multicultural settings or with people from different cultural groups and how you prep for that or change your approach.
That's a really good question. My experience with that, honestly, has been I've brought in someone else to moderate them. So when I had a client who wanted groups conducted with Spanish speakers, I brought in a moderator to do that. When I had a client who wanted groups with African Americans, I brought in an African American moderator. You don't have to do that, but that was something that the client specifically asked for. I do think that you need to be able to understand how their culture and their beliefs influence the research. And that was, for me, one of the other advantages of bringing in a specialist. And that was allowing us to know what they're really saying. Are they just being overly polite? Because that's just how their culture is and we're not getting the information, or are there particular questions and approaches? We did this research that I'm thinking about because I wanted to see the differences. Did it make a difference in how someone responded if they were African American versus Hispanic or whatever? So so those, I think, are things important to keep in consideration, the types of questions and the way those people might respond. You also can think about recruiting challenges. It might make sense to go into community groups locally and talk with them and recruit through that. If you want to go at random and even off your list and try and figure out who is what, it's going to be really tough. You can't always tell by names. And so my recommendation is to do a recruit, is to go in very specific, to go to a community center or a group locally.
I'm curious if there's any kind of research or kind of industry understanding as far as introducing bias through someone moderating as an employee or a representative of an organization versus being a neutral third party, and similarly with venue, if you're with an arts organization, if actually conducting a session at the venue somewhere as opposed to kind of a neutral third party site, whether bias can be introduced or avoided through that.
So the advantage of a traditional focus group facility is you can remove the bias because you're in a neutral place and you've got a mirror and I've got people sitting behind it, and I say to the participants in the focus group, I have some research colleagues with me who are behind the mirror. They're back there. I let them take notes. So I acknowledge that there's someone back there, but I don't ever say, who it is who's back there, the CEO of Alaska Airlines. I don't say that type of thing. I do that on purpose because I want to try and remove some of the bias. But that, I think, is a challenge because it's an expense. So what you can do is, when I do it in a client's facility, by having me be a neutral party, that helps. That's part of my introduction. If you're doing it yourself and you're with whatever the organization is, so let's say we're here at the Wing Luke and you're representing them, you just have to be really careful with your questions. Because your goal is to ask questions and get responses. You cannot defend. And so if, I don't like any of the exhibits there, well, what's wrong with them? You've got to be neutral. That's your real challenge. So you can do what you can to try and remove the bias, and you have to decide how does that weigh out with finances, and then what makes the most sense. One of the things I don't like to do is I don't like to fill the room full of a lot of people observing. So let's say we use this room here and you have 10 people sitting around a table talking. I wouldn't then line the wall with 10 other people. I do like to be honest. I typically have just said, these are my research colleagues. I haven't actually introduced them as members of the staff at the Wing Luke. So you kind of, it's back to weighing that out. And I think the biggest difference is your moderating. So if you can ask questions and remain neutral and not defend, I think you're good there. If your budget doesn't warrant going out and doing a facility, you may not have a choice. I think curiosity is really important. Being fascinated by people and how they live and how they react and what they're thinking. Those types of things I think are really important. I am not a super outgoing person. Put me in a room full of people, you're not going to hear a word out of me. That's just not my style, so I don't think you have to be particularly outgoing. I think if anything, it's really that ability to listen and to be compassionate. I am here to make people feel comfortable and to have fun and to engage with me and to know that I am listening and what they have to say is super important. And I get a lot more information out of folks that way. I have people say that they feel comfortable, and that's your goal, is to make people feel comfortable, and then you'll get the information you're looking for. So he's asking about the average size of a focus group. When I first started in this industry many, many years ago, it was 10. People always did groups with 10. The industry has really transitioned down to doing 8 or even 6. I personally like 8. I think 10's a few too many, but I'll do 10. I think 8's ideal. I think 6 is almost too small. I don't feel like you get that group think and that occurs in a focus group with 8 people. Somehow 6 almost gets too small. So for your purposes, I love 8. I think that's a good number. And we always over-recruit. So I would recruit 10 for 8 to show. Just because you never know if someone's going to not show up. So you want to at least have a room full of people.
Yeah, focus groups are one piece of the overall research plan, but they are, I think, very vital as a first step sometimes. I know that quite often companies, organizations will use focus groups. We'll have Nancy conduct these as an exploratory tool. You may have a really specific issue or question that your organization is dealing with in terms of maybe price increases, change of venue, an exhibition, looking at an exhibition that maybe you want to bring in. You're not sure whether it's going to work or not. Sometimes very specific kinds of questions that you want to ask. I think it's also important to use this technique to just stay in touch. Too often, we are so busy and so caught up with our own organization, and we're stressed out that we don't take time to go outside of the four walls of our organization, whether you're opera, symphony, ballet, museum, any performing or visual arts. I think we get caught up in what's going on in our own world and our own challenges, and we forget that there's a whole world out there. And a focus group can be a way of just sort of loosening things up, where you can talk to your subscribers, talk to your single ticket patrons, sometimes talking to volunteers. The volunteers are on the front line. They probably have more interaction with your customer base, so to speak, than you do being in the office, being staff. And so I think if you think about all those different audiences and how focus groups can really just kind of explore, take an hour, take an hour and a half, 2 hours if you can, but give them an opportunity to just talk about what Nancy is saying, feelings. How do they feel? What do they like? What don't they like? And don't put any kind of qualifiers on that. Use that as maybe an injection of creativity and ideas to think about what you're going to ask if you get into kind of the quantitative side of surveys. Too often, I think we just jump right into wanting to do surveys before we really think about, well, what is it we really want to find out? Focus groups, I think, are a great tool to do that. And they have been around for a very, very, very long time, and I think they've played a really valuable role in being that sort of exploratory tool. So if you've done focus groups, you really understand that. If you haven't, don't be afraid to do them. And don't be afraid to look for ways to do them efficiently. You don't have to be an expert moderator. It helps. And if you have a budget to do that, but there's also ways that you can use professionals where Nancy can consult, can offer advice and counsel and direction without actually having to sort of take the reins and do the whole thing. Certainly if you have big budget and you can afford it, that's, it's a proper way to perform this kind of methodology. But don't let that be a barrier. Reach out to your subscribers, reach out to your visitors, and you would be amazed at how often the one thing that they say at the end of the group is, thank you for inviting us. Thank you for giving us an opportunity to talk about this. Nobody's ever asked for my opinion about XYZ, and now you've done that. So I think you'd be very shocked and surprised at how, I think, enlightening focus groups can be, or depth interviews. That is really can be, I think, one major step in just kind of launching into this whole world of research. If you've been in focus groups yourself, you kind of know that. If you've conducted them yourself or have your organization, or you've been in an organization, you understand that. Sure, they can be expensive, on a cost per person basis, extremely expensive. But when you really think about, well, how can we do this? If you have no budget or a very limited budget, there are ways to do it. So don't let that get in the way of being kind of research-driven and using this information to form that strategic intelligence piece that's really all a part of it.